joining us today. Today we will be talking about how does green hydrogen fit into electrify everything. So my name is Neva Espinoza. I'm going to be moderating this session. I'm the Vice President of Energy Supply and Low Carbon Resources at the Electric Power Research Institute, and we're really excited to be with you here today and have this conversation. For those who may not have been part of other sessions throughout the event today, there's some functionality within the platform we're using. So, of course, you see the chat function here on your right. So we would welcome you throughout the session. So please drop in comments or questions in the chat. We'll certainly be pulling from there throughout the next 45 minutes or so. And if you've just joined us, we'd love to hear where you're coming to us from. So please drop in the chat where you're located. I'm coming from Charlotte, North Carolina today. We've also preloaded a few polls. So if you'd like to choose the poll tab there, you can go in. We have 4 different questions for you guys. We're asking for what time frame you see green hydrogen becoming part of our energy solution. Has your company actually set a decarbonization commitment or goal? What do you see as the most important application for hydrogen? And what industry do you represent? So if you guys go in and answer that poll, we'll pull from those results a little later in the session for part of our conversation. And then, of course, there is the Q&A tab too. So if you want to drop any questions in there, we'll also be monitoring that throughout the session. Emily, coming from New York City, my favorite. So we're happy you're here, Emily. Okay, with that, I think I will get us right into it and really use these 45 minutes well. So I'll introduce very quickly. We have 3 panelists today to help lead this conversation. We have Holt Bradshaw from Siemens Industries, Thomas Koch Blank he's a senior principal from Breakthrough Technology at RMI. And then, of course, Janice Lynn, who's the founder and CEO of Strategen. So excited to have all 3 of you here, where we're really going to dig into really what I like to think of as some of the last pieces of decarbonization, the hardest pieces of decarbonization. So once we've gone through and we've electrified those that we can, how does green hydrogen fit in? And maybe it fits in up front, maybe it fits in downstream, but how does that really fit into the conversation of electrify everything and what that looks like? So Holt, we'll just start right with you. We'll jump right in. So if you can maybe give us a brief introduction of yourself the first time you guys speak, that would be great. So Holt, why don't you give us a feel for, how Siemens views hydrogen and how it fits into the overall energy system?
Okay, I'd be happy to. As Neva said, Holt Bradshaw. I'm with Siemens Industry, particularly the Siemens PTI organization, which is a consulting firm, an independent consulting firm within Siemens. We work a lot with utilities and developers around a whole range of energy projects. We tend to be very deep in commercial and strategic aspects of the projects. Siemens has been, if you've been following, pretty interested in hydrogen for a while. Maybe more in Europe than in the U.S., though that's changing rather rapidly. There are parts at Siemens that will supply all sorts of hardware and software. We're more on the study side, so trying to understand how those technologies or other people might be applied to solve various problems in the system, whether that's bulk storage, whether that's different kinds of renewable fuels, etc. So it's a pretty interesting place right now. We're working on a number of different projects, both for utilities and developers, that involve hydrogen, and helping them to devise sort of viable business models and figuring out how the structure of those projects will go together. So I'll stop there, and we can always come back to that in more detail as folks are interested.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Holt. So Janice, I'll go to you next. So founder and CEO of Strategen. I know you founded several nonprofits in your career, the last one being the Green Hydrogen Coalition, and then some recent exciting news around HyDeal of Los Angeles. So can you tell us maybe a bit more about that project and what you guys are seeing and learning so far?
Definitely. So first, a quick introduction about Strategen. We're a professional services firm that's mission driven, and we specialize in advancing market development. So we do a lot of work across the full clean energy spectrum, from efficiency to renewables, storage, a lot of work on storage, and now green hydrogen. So we started the Green Hydrogen Coalition, I want to say a little more than a year and a half ago, as it is a 501c3, so it's an educational nonprofit, and its mission is to accelerate the green hydrogen economy. And we do this several ways. One, we're very active in establishing an appropriate legal and regulatory framework for green hydrogen. Two, we're aggregating and forming collaborations at the state and provincial level, so that state and provincial level governments can coordinate to create the roadmap for accelerating green hydrogen infrastructure development. And lastly, but most significantly, is HyDeal North America, which is a platform we launched a couple of weeks ago, modeled after HyDeal Ambition, which is a very successful initiative that is literally architecting the ecosystem for green hydrogen. And we're replicating, what do they say? Imitation's the best form of flattery. We're replicating HyDeal North America. We're replicating HyDeal Ambition. The platform's called HyDeal North America. And we're very happy to announce last week that our first initiative, and the idea is you create the ecosystem in a targeted location, is in Los Angeles, HyDeal Los Angeles. So that's what we're up to.
Fantastic. I know that's been super exciting. I'm sure we'll kind of dive into that more, because I know you guys have some pretty aggressive goals. I think it was $1.50 per kilogram hydrogen by 2030. Is that right?
Yes.
Very, very exciting. So Thomas, why don't you give us some of your thoughts and some of your insights? So I know you spent most of your career, a lot of your career, focusing on breakthrough and disruptive technologies. So when you look at hydrogen, is hydrogen the technology that's going to help us meet kind of the world's decarbonization goals? Where's your head on it?
I wish it was a silver bullet, but clearly it's helping. I think the development of the hydrogen space over the last 18 months has been tremendous. It's been an amazing journey of how I think not only the discussion around hydrogen, but more importantly, the discussion around the actual opportunity for some sectors of our economy to achieve a decarbonized business has gone from impossible to we can do it. And that's a pretty significant shift. And a lot of, I think, sectors are trying to figure out to what extent they're leaning on biofuels and to what extent they're leaning on hydrogen. I think the benefit with biofuels being that is more of a drop-in fuel than hydrogen. I think the very obvious downside is the challenges with sustainable supply, and we don't really have that challenge with hydrogen. But the lack of direct drop-in substitution is making it less of a silver bullet. But with that said, there is not a single hard-to-abate sector where you can't say, what about hydrogen? And everyone goes, yeah, hydrogen is a good solution. And I think that's what we're seeing is pulling a lot of the excitement for the fuel.
Impossible, but shifting to we can do it. I agree. So Janice, kind of from your perspective, what do you see as the biggest challenges we need to address to support those hard-to-abate sectors?
Yeah, so I love it. From impossible to yes, we can. I'd say that where we're at now is we're doing it. The challenge, if you talk to anybody with green hydrogen today, it's simply too expensive. And we know we can produce it at scale for a much, much lower cost. I mean, we've seen this happen with wind and solar and batteries and many, many other industrial commodities. It will be cheaper once we produce it at scale, but even that's not good enough. We need to find ways to achieve low delivered costs, and that incorporates transport, it incorporates storage, and with any bulk commodity product, the most cost-effective way to achieve low delivered costs will be through infrastructure. And actually, we just had a webinar this morning to learn about the progress in HyDeal Ambition, and we learned what's happening with the European Hydrogen Backbone Initiative, and some of the themes and takeaways, and this is what we're incorporating into HyDeal LA is, the way out of this is we have to think big. It's all about scale. Pilots are great, but we need to make a great leap forward, because it's when we're at scale we can afford that necessary infrastructure that will drop that transport and storage and delivery cost down to, cents as opposed to dollars. And on this point of multisectoral decarbonization, if your goal is deep decarbonization and affordability, the gas infrastructure is key. One of the data points that was talked about by OGE, which is the leading gas supplier, pipeline company in Germany, is one gas pipeline, like a 42-inch pipeline, transmits as much energy as 8 high voltage electric lines. So the volume of energy, and when you look at the energy consumption, and I'm a huge supporter of electrification, and we can electrify many, many uses, but at some point you can only go so far. And when you look at the opportunity of decarbonization, we start getting into fuels and heat applications, and applications that will be very hard to electrify. And that's where hydrogen will shine. And in terms of overcoming the barriers, other lessons learned that we're seeing in Europe and we're incorporating into our approach here is that integrated planning is absolutely key. And, and I mean that in the broadest possible sense. So integrated planning, when we think about the gas system, we're going to have a parallel green hydrogen system. When we think about the electric sector, we need to simultaneously think about the gas sector and how we optimize both of this infrastructure to achieve rapid decarbonization of transportation and industrial applications. And that transition is difficult, right? For a period of time, we're going to have duplicative infrastructure. We're going to have parallel systems. Ultimately, the one way out in the future is green and clean. But between now and then, we're going to have to, find our way forward. And we have to think about the cost of that system as a social good, that this is a benefit for everyone. And if you try to pin all the infrastructure costs on just the first movers, it makes it really hard to move forward, because that infrastructure, it cannot be borne just by your initial first movers. The cost is too great, and the infrastructure at the end of the day will serve all. And then the final point is, on barriers, and barriers are also an opportunity. I think the greatest area for innovation today here in North America is in thinking about our legal and regulatory frameworks that will enable this vision. Because it's not only, we have technologies today that, we could do this. These technologies have been around. Someone was telling me electrolysis was invented 200 years ago. We have turbines that can combust hydrogen. We can make it, we can store it. Heck, gray hydrogen's a very mature global commodity, so we know how to store it, move it. Really, what's needed is innovations and thinking about new uses, new pathways to aggregate demand, bring the ecosystem together, and do this again in that great leap forward. So we can do it at scale, do it clean, and importantly, find ways to finance it and make it bankable. And the solution to that lies in how we structure the market.
And I love this idea of this great leap forward, right? You have to think of it much bigger. You can't think of it little in pieces. Mm-hmm. So, I think I'll open up the same question to Holt and Thomas. Do you guys have initial thoughts or reactions to barriers, opportunities? What's really going to enable us to support the hard to abate sectors?
I think one of the big challenges is that different pieces of the puzzle come in different increments of scale. So you have on one side, you have buses that use not so much hydrogen for each bus, but then you have a production facility that is orders of magnitude larger, and you have you have a steel mill that is, one steel mill corresponds to 100,000 fuel cell buses, which is a lot of buses. And then if you then add into that the notion of a backbone infrastructure that comes in even one more order of magnitude larger, laying out, it goes back to the integrative planning that Janice mentioned, that laying out this over time is going to expose all these different assets for a quite challenging utilization outlook, and that's one of the challenges for bankability. I think that each addition to the system that comes in, a specific size has got to match a lot of other pieces, and before you get to the scale of the market where those incremental additions are in the noise, that's where you are in the power market and the natural gas market, that each incremental addition is really a marginal addition, and it's sort of a rounding error in the big scheme of things of capacities. But these markets are so nascent that each addition is significant.
I see the development of hydrogen following a path similar to merchant power 20 years ago and perhaps small scale LNG a decade ago. The issues were the technology. There's certainly scale issues, and we need to figure out how to deliver it at a lower cost and things like that. There's no doubt there's those issues, but they're ones that engineers can overcome with the right amount of money and the right amount of time. The questions are more around business model, and how do you come up with a sustainable business model that's financeable? How do you find anchor clients that will fund these kinds of projects, right? Where's the offtake with a steady credit? Where's the offtaker that will ultimately be willing to get behind these kind of projects? And there are those. We're seeing them appear in the market today, and there are people willing to take more risk now than we did 20 years ago in the first merchant power boom, or 10 years ago in the small scale kind of LNG boom. So I think that's moving, and it's going to move faster. There's a lot of lessons from that, but I still come back to the notion that you've got to have the right business model for a given facility at whatever scale it happens to be, to get it close enough to being bankable, right? There's certainly some things one can do with incentives and tax breaks and support it. They can help, but you've got to be reasonably close on the numbers, right? Before someone will step out and take that kind of risk. But there are those that are doing it now. I mean, we're involved in several of those kind of projects right now where people are genuinely looking at modifying facilities, building new facilities, and again, it's not the technology so much as that who's going to buy it for what price, and what's the right market to take my hydrogen to, and how am I going to deliver it? Is it close enough I'm going to take my hydrogen and actually make a synthetic natural gas out of it and then use the natural gas system, right? Because most of our gas system's really not ready for more than 10% hydrogen in it, right? Our system's a little different than the European system. We're not based on an old town gas system that had a higher hydrogen content. So, do you then liquefy it and put it on rail cars? Certainly viable, right? That's been done. In fact, the permission's been out there for to move LNG as a product in the U.S. as a rail product for about a year now. Most people, that sets a really nice foundation for hydrogen movement as well. So I think we're going to move a lot faster than we did in the past with other energy types of projects.
Absolutely. Holt, you brought up the idea of synthetic fuels and talked about infrastructure, and I think these things become a really important part of the conversation to understand how hydrogen tends to be kind of the first thing you create. There's lots of derivative products that can come out of it. You can use it as a pure form, of course. You could blend it. You can create another product from it, et cetera, et cetera. We talk about how I always think about, we talk about hydrogen because that's kind of what comes first, and then a million things come later, right? So, but when you think about the capability or the potential for synthetic or derivative fuels and the infrastructure needs, some of what Holt talked about here, I know there's lots of hype around we're going to blend it in the natural gas pipeline and the problem solved. How do you guys see that situation, and where do you see that going? Do you think that's a real pathway for us, or do you see what Janice said, which is more of a maybe blend for a time, duplicative infrastructure for a time before we fully transition?
So I think blending, just quickly, I think blending could be an opportunity to solve for that mismatch in capacity scales, because the natural gas system is such a large, if you like, reservoir of that, that can actually absorb quite a lot of hydrogen without, compromising the quality of the gas or the experience of the consumer. So I don't think it's a pathway for, obviously, blending and transitioning to 100% through blending, but it does play an important role in balancing the different the different stages of the supply chain in my mind.
I wanted to comment on this, Neva, as well, that I think that you raise a really good point, that one of the amazing things about hydrogen is it's so flexible, right? You can go into, fuel cells, it can go into synthetic fuels. It's also incredibly diverse on the production side. So we can make it from electricity, we can make it from organic waste, both biogas as well as solids. I mean, heck, I'm even told that you can make hydrogen out of like gasifying plastic and all kinds of stuff. And then once you have that hydrogen, it can go into multiple sectors, into multiple forms. It's an energy carrier. What I described earlier of having dual infrastructures, I mean, this is what they're doing in Europe. We believe, all these pathways are fair game, putting it on a rail car. There's even a company that's inventing a way to move hydrogen by airship. We need all of the above. We do know, because we've had hydrogen pipelines in commercial existence for a long time, we have a lot of experience with natural gas pipelines, that this infrastructure, if you have a sufficient off-taker, production and source and off-taker base, is a very low cost of moving the molecule. And perhaps the thing that we need to bear in mind is to really, and this gets back to your original question of barriers and what can we do about this, is out-of-the-box multi-sectoral thinking. So Thomas, you mentioned there's like every little increment is a different mismatch. How we're thinking about it is, let's pick a location, figure out, with great specificity. So who are the off-takers, aggregate them together, figure out across sectors how much demand you can aggregate, and then reverse engineer. What's the infrastructure that makes sense? And maybe in the beginning you do some direct injection and blending in the gas pipeline, but ultimately our hypothesis, and this has been borne out on the work that's already been done in Europe, is that one of the most cost-effective ways is going to be to have 100% hydrogen pipelines, and someday, maybe repurpose our natural gas backbone. That doesn't mean that we can't have rail cars. It doesn't mean that we won't also be doing some green ammonia, because there's lots of applications that can use ammonia too, and ammonia is very dense form storage. So I guess I'll just close with this and say, I think that we have to think about all the solutions. It's not an either or. We need all of it, and we need to go as fast as possible. And one way that we can move as fast as possible is through leadership. And, I would encourage all the policymakers and CEOs and the heads of industrial companies, think about this great leap forward, and how can we work together as we've never worked before to collaborate and think about these circular economy pathways. Los Angeles's waste every day is a great feedstock for making hydrogen. One company's waste is another company's treasure. And how can we all come together to build that infrastructure so we can deliver the stuff as cheaply as possible? So that's kind of the I think the mindset shift that we need to have.
Absolutely. As a moderator, I'm not allowed to have an opinion, but I definitely think an abundance of technology is very important across the entire spectrum as we look at this challenge together. Thomas, did you have any thoughts on synthetic fuels maybe you'd like to share?
I think to Janice's point, there are some applications where a derived fuel based on hydrogen makes sense, maybe from an energy density perspective, or just sometimes in some industries it's just a feedstock, right? So there's an opportunity even for hydrogen to be a feedstock into the fertilizer industry through refinement into ammonia, green ammonia on the way, and that will decarbonize a significant amount of fertilizer production around the globe, potentially, right? So I think there are uses of hydrogen definitely in refined forms where it makes more sense than in in the sort of gaseous form. And it is, the movement of hydrogen is, it's not surprising that it's cheap to move in a pipeline. It's very analogous with the rest of our gases or our fossil fuels, that we tend to move the natural gas long distances and then we convert it to power and we move it shorter distances to the consumer. And it's the same with hydrogen. Depending on conditions, a pipeline of hydrogen can be up to 10 times cheaper than a high voltage over, a transmission line for power. So going back to integrative planning, not developing, especially as we increase the renewable penetration of our electricity systems, and we want to use as much of the low cost renewables as possible that we have in the world and in the US. That's gonna point us towards where we want to build those renewables. And then the question is, do we want to move those electrons close to consumers, convert it to hydrogen, and then move it to the end consumer? Or do we want to make hydrogen close to the renewables and then move it in a pipeline? And I think the jury is out on exactly how that trade-off is going to break down, but it's not obvious. And I think the added complication is that the last mile of movage is quite expensive. So as soon as you move it out of the pipeline, moving hydrogen around becomes suddenly quite expensive. So there's where I think synthetic fuels can play a role, because you can have last mile distribution can be cheaper as well. And again, I don't have any definitive answers here. We will need a lot of different solutions in a portfolio here, but there are some broad strokes that we can see emerging here in terms of what solutions make sense. Neva, you're on mute.
You're muted, Neva.
A virtual conference without someone being on mute, and 99% of the time that someone is me. So, check mark. Well, I should be able to keep it good for the next 12 minutes here. Okay, so I would like to jump to some of the Q&A that people have dropped in the chat, and one's around safety, right? And I won't read you the whole thing, but really, can we convince the world, because hydrogen is not something you talk about at your dinner table. I mean, everyone on this call and in this session may, but the general public does not talk about hydrogen, right? So in people, and I get the question all the time, well, what about the Hindenburg? Right? That question comes to me at least once a week. So when you look about some of the safety aspects of what this future energy system may look like, what are your thoughts? Can we get, one, can we make it safe? I have an opinion on that, but one, can we make it safe? Two, can we convince everybody that we can make it safe?
I have a comment on that. First of all, I would say it's already safe. There's something on the order of 100 million metric tons of hydrogen produced and sold around the world. I can't remember the market share of the United States, but it's all gray hydrogen made from fossil fuels, but that hydrogen's produced, it's safely stored, it's transported both in pipelines, stored in above ground containers, pressurized containers, moved on trucks, on rail, and stored in underground salt caverns. In fact, the US has 3 of them in commercial operation today, and something like 1,600 miles of hydrogen pipeline, including, maybe 15, 20 miles right there in downtown LA. So it's already safe. I think our challenge is bringing hydrogen, and a green hydrogen molecule, I use chemically identical to a gray hydrogen molecule, and bringing it and applying this new green zero carbon hydrogen and applying it to new uses that maybe are a little new, but proven in multiple industries around the world, such as and this may be a good question for Holt, but one of my favorite applications is combusting hydrogen in a gas turbine in lieu of natural gas, because that enables us to store vast quantities of really low cost wind and solar, and then to turn it into electricity whenever we want, maybe for weeks at a time, months, even seasons.
Well, that's a really important point that sort of hasn't shown up in the hydrogen debate yet. But as we move to a more renewable grid, power grid that is, storage, bulk storage of energy becomes a much bigger question. If you think historically about it, we've managed that sort of weeks, months, seasonal storage with a pile of coal and natural gas in a cavern, that sort of thing. If we're going to move away from that fossil world, then we still have to have some way to deal with that. And lithium-ion batteries are probably not the answer for that, not at the kind of scale we're talking about. It's just it's a level of energy, it's an order of magnitude most people aren't familiar with. It's a lot of zeros in the back of what you're used to for folks who are not deep in energy. And hydrogen is a really interesting option for that, or some form of hydrogen, right? It's one of the derivatives could be. Leaves you with that option to have 2 or 3 months worth of storage. And actually, it's interesting. That's where we worked on synthetic natural gas, was for utility. It was thinking exactly that way. How do I gas system, the existing storage, the existing line pack abilities to store renewable power and bring it back when I needed it for seasonal applications. Right? And it's an interesting way to think about it. And I'll add to that, when you think about something like synthetic natural gas, and I'm not saying I'm a proponent, but one of the interesting angles to that is what happens to all the gas infrastructure if you don't find a way to use it? Where are the producers, the midstream guys, and the local utilities going to fit into this mix? I've talked to CFOs that are worried that they're going to be out of business. They're worried that they won't be able to raise money to even fix the existing system if people don't think they're going to be in business 30 years from now, right? Nobody wants to loan the money. So, question, which means they should be quite interested in getting on board, right? They should be quite intrigued by how do they transform their own systems, their own supply, right? Whether it's the synthetic natural gas or pure hydrogen or whatever, how do they stay relevant in the local delivery of energy into business, for example?
I think taking that into the perspective of electrification, which is the backdrop theme of this of this session, you shouldn't underestimate the sheer volume of electricity that's required to electrify heavy industry. I mean, if you look at electrifying personal vehicles, there's a lot of batteries going in, but the utilization of vehicles is so low that if you look, it's adding, if you're lucky, double-digit % on your electricity system, likely just single-digit % increase in electricity consumption. But adding electrified industry to the mix is in many cases going to give you a factor of 2 in electricity demand. So, I mean, if we're looking at honestly and truly decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors to achieve net zero by 2050, we're going to have to double our electricity system in 30 years. And that's a lot of electrification. And it happens indirectly because we electrify the production of hydrogen, and then we use the hydrogen in many cases. But ultimately, we're not going to need 100% renewables. We're going to need 200%. And if you look at a global perspective, if you take into account economic development and population growth in underserved communities around the world, we're not looking at 100, we're looking at 300, because we have all that additional economic growth from countries coming as well. So there is a lot to say about the challenge of electrification, and I think the hydrogen piece here is an amazing opportunity and a business opportunity for utilities to really get into one of the biggest couple of growth decades in the history almost of power making.
I'd love to piggyback on this because I think of at least one of the pathways to make hydrogen the electrolytic pathway. It is an extension of electrification, right? It's the ability to use low cost electricity, whether that's hydro, wind, solar, curtailed electricity that we wouldn't have used anyway, and converting it into a fuel that can then displace market share in other sectors, in liquid fuels, and start to enter new market opportunities. And I'd see there like half the audience is in the energy side. I don't know if they're on the utility side or on the developer side. But if I were a renewable developer, this is really good news. This is like serious blue ocean strategy. Your market share is not constrained to the limits of the electrical interconnection capacity. You can start making hydrogen and selling it to other sectors. If you are an electric utility using the electric system to bring those electrons to wherever you need to make it locally is also a way to, load growth. Electrolysis equipment is incredibly flexible and modular, and once the hydrogen's produced, even if you can't inject it into the gas system, you can still store it locally, and hydrogen doesn't go bad like gasoline over time. It just sits there, so you can use it for backup. And then lastly, we can make hydrogen electrolytically or from waste, from garbage, from landfill gas, and then use our existing gas pipeline system, which again is this incredibly valuable infrastructure, but for a cleaner purpose. And that kind of infrastructure optimization and reuse of what we already have will preserve jobs, keep those. I think Holt, you mentioned that, what are they going to do if they're not moving some kind of fuel? Keep it affordable and make the transition possible. And I think it's an awesome opportunity, because when you think about this from a global perspective, not everybody is blessed with all these abundant resources to make green hydrogen, right? If you're Singapore and your land mass is like that big, there's really not a lot of options to make. You're going to be an importer. Same thing with Japan. And this is why Australia and Chile and Spain and Saudi Arabia are investing and ramping up right now, because they see it coming and they want a big share of that future global demand. And the time to act is now, because this country needs to have a share of that too. We're blessed with amazing resources. And once we start exporting this, that's another opportunity for tremendous economic growth.
And it's great input, everyone. So, one of the things we said we wanted to talk about is time frame here. So if you go look at our poll, 63% of our audience, with mind you, is only 14 people. So you guys need to do a better job of going to do those polls, is saying that hydrogen is going to become part of this energy solution in this decade. So talk to me a little bit about policy and financing, because we talked about those things as being maybe potential challenges. There's a lot of questions that have popped up in the Q&A specifically around policy. So what is it going to take in the next decade, maybe two, in terms of policy and financing to get this done?
Well, fortunately, there's some activity in that front already, right? So there are places where hydrogen is being treated as a renewable natural gas, for example, right? So you're starting to see some real interest in the Pacific Northwest, for example. There are other places where, regardless of policy, they're moving ahead, right? Like I say, I know a number of developers that are active on projects like this. Some are repowering projects, some are brand new greenfield projects. But either way, they see the opportunity and they want to be there. Now, they tend to be, I don't know, it's a combination. I've seen small firms that are really well financed and backed by people who are really excited by the opportunity to make a real difference. And I've seen it by the biggest companies who feel they can manage the risk, right? So that they can manage if the project doesn't go as well for a few years and that sort of thing. I've seen both sides of that. And there are pilot projects, underway in the U.S. now, and of course more so if you look internationally, right? I think we alluded to that before, but Europe's probably got half of the projects underway at this point in time. And there's some interesting integrated projects there as well, and I think that's probably one of the keys to getting the financing, right? Is showing enough viable revenue streams that'll bring in the financiers. Whether I'm making hydrogen for a seasonal power application mixed with some green ammonia, which could be used either as a fertilizer, as a marine fuel now. You could have a number of different revenue streams, each one with different contracting off-takers and that sort of thing. And that's going to bring financiers. They'll be interested in supporting something like that. It's really about the money, right?
Yeah, my comment on the policy, and this gets back to what I was saying earlier, is that national and regional and state and provincial leadership is critical, because when you have a resource as flexible, both in terms of how it's made and how it's used for hydrogen, and there's this opportunity for shared infrastructure, having that coordinated leadership top down is really important. That as we launch into this brave new future, we're not suboptimally building infrastructure, right? like the infrastructure. And it's challenging because the way we're set up in many places around the world, there's different agencies that are responsible for different parts of an, there's one agency may look after electric, another one looks after air quality, another one looks after the gas system. And even the way they're organized is they have separate proceedings and very stovepiped processes for looking and doing the planning, the long-term planning, the investment. And so the optimal solution for society is to look across, right? We need a silo buster that's going to implement a planning process that cuts across jurisdictions, cuts across sectors, and starts to do that integrated planning. And that's really hard to do without that leadership. And so that would be my first recommendation. And then secondly, there are a number of issues, like sub-issues, that will facilitate efficient movement forward. And I'll give you an example. In Germany, because they're much further along in figuring out how to transform and repurpose their gas pipeline system into a hydrogen backbone, they realized, this existing gas network, it's really prolific, it's everywhere, it works really good, and you know what, we can actually use this. It's not that expensive to convert it to hydrogen, but all of our franchise agreements and permits are for natural gas. So they're considering legislation right now in the front of the German parliament that says, if you have a permit to operate your gas pipeline, it automatically applies for hydrogen. Because imagine without that, you would have to, once you start introducing hydrogen in the pipeline, you would have to go through and renegotiate every single municipal permit. That would be a real bummer, to say the least. That would take forever. I mean, we're like, oh my gosh. So there are certain really smart moves that need to be made early on that contemplate the end game and the vision across sectors. And we need to start working on those right now, and we need to do that here also.
And I think there is, I'm not at all saying that there is no role for policy, because I think there is a really important role in some aspects for policy, but sometimes there is an over belief that there is a perfect market design here that policymakers can fix, then the problem is solved. But I mean, if you look at the power markets in the U.S., you have hundreds of different rate structures. If you look at the different wholesale markets and you overlay the distribution markets, and they have the co-ops, and if you look at what exposure you have at the end use, but literally hundreds of different rate structures, tariffs that are applied, and that's very apparently a functioning market anyway, right? So I think it's quite important to not try to over regulate, maybe, right, and try to design everything from a regulatory perspective, because markets are quite versatile in figuring these things out, as long as you have the basics in place. And there is a need for basics here in terms of policy for hydrogen, because it's such a most of the hydrogen, even if it's an existing market, a lot of it is captive, so it's within the same company from one industrial asset to the other, and there is some trading in these chemical clusters, and a few examples of where it's traded outside, but it's really the broadly traded cross-company markets are very nascent. So I think there is need for some level of regulations, and we shouldn't also, I think, shy away from that. Regulations has really helped to create the electricity market and the natural gas market, and that is that's been very powerful.
Absolutely. Great comments, everyone.
Oh,
sorry, Holt, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I think using the existing infrastructure as much as we can is critical. It's not a secret that the hardest things to build in the U.S. are pipelines and overhead power lines, right? You're talking decades, and they may not get through, right? Millions and billions are spent, and projects don't finish, and for a whole host of reasons, right? It's an incredibly complicated process to build something like that. So to the degree we can use existing infrastructure creatively, it's going to help speed this up.
Absolutely. Well, fantastic comments, everyone, and just great participation. We have about 30 seconds left, so I'm going to leave you with one quick thought, one quick question we'll go through really quickly. I know we're all saying the technology's there. I would have to say, I think the technology, although it's starting to be ready, it's not fully there for full scale at the flexibility and capability we need it, is kind of where my head is on that. So what are the early stage technologies that may need some support, may need some finances? We'll run through it real quick and then we'll wrap up, I promise. Who wants to go first? And Thomas, we'll go because you have technology in your title, buddy. You're up.
There we go. I'm on the spot. No, I think, look, electrolyzers clearly need to come down the cost curve, learning curve here in terms of cost. That's the one I'll pick.
Janice?
All right, my favorite is geologic storage. We already know we can store hydrogen in salt caverns, but what about retired oil wells, retired natural gas caverns, aquifers? Not everybody has a salt dome right underfoot. So I'm hoping that's an area that you guys will study at LCRI, Neva.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, we do too. And Holt, what do you think?
I'm going to go with delivery. I'm going to go with
Delivery.
the challenges of either getting a pipeline that works or, liquefaction and delivery options. Though the other
Absolutely.
two are perfectly viable as well. So
it's across the board. There's lots to do, and I think I'll sum up this panel with kind of 3 different things. And it's a combination of what all of you said, I think. But we're going from it's impossible to yes we can to yes we are, and I love that because I think that great leap forward, as Janice said, is going to take the entire value chain to come together and do it. So. Great panel. Thank you guys for being here today. And thank everybody for joining us. I think we still have 97 or 8 people on and we're a minute over. So everyone have a great rest of your day. And it was great chatting with you.
Thank you, Neva. Thanks,
Thank
Thomas
you.
and Holt. Thanks, everyone on the phone. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.